Welcome everyone again to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Series, weekly discussions of practice and science featuring experts in behavioral health and the law. The series is run by the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences of the University of New Mexico's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences in support with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director here at the University of New Mexico. Before we get started, I did want to give you the continuing education credit info here. I will talk about this more in detail shortly, letting you know that our presenter does not have a financial arrangement related to the content of this activity, and the views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily represent the views, policies, and positions of the University of New Mexico. Now, with that out of the way, for our talk, if you have any questions for our presenter, make sure you enter them in the Q&A box. You can enter those anytime you feel comfortable, but do know that we hold those until the end, and oftentimes it's not possible for us to get through all of them in time. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet that is posted in the chat box shortly. If you're pursuing APA continuing education credits, that link will also be posted in the chat box, but in the latter portions of the talk near the end of the hour. So keep your eye on the chat box. Make sure that you save that link if you don't open it before the webinar ends. And make sure you save your certificate after you complete the survey, because we don't have access to completed surveys after the fact. If you missed last week's talk in the series, Dr. Anna Abate's riveting talk on resentencing evaluations in the context of the second look movement is now available on our YouTube channel. As a heads up for next week's talk in the series, we have Dr. Kevin Baldwin, who will be discussing the past, present, and future of mental health courts. But circling back this week, I'm thrilled to introduce you to today's panel, who'll be doing a Q&A on memory, including its malleability. This is Dr. Elizabeth Loftus and Dr. Jeff Younggren. So Dr. Jeffrey Younggren will be moderating the questions, and he's a forensic psychologist currently that's also a clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of New Mexico. He's a fellow of APA and distinguished member of the National Academies of Practice, has served on numerous boards of committees, including the Council of Representatives of APA, the Ethics Committee for the California Psychological Association and APA Committee on Accreditation, and the list goes on. Dr. Younggren also consults to various licensing boards on ethics and standards of care. He qualifies as an expert in civil, criminal, and administrative proceedings, and continues to serve as a risk management consultant to the trust and its policyholders. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus is our expert respondent, and she is a distinguished professor at the University of California, Irvine, where she holds faculty positions in the Department of Psychological Science, the Department of Criminology, Law and Society, and the School of Law. She received her Ph.D. in psychology from Stanford University, and since that time has published over 20 books and over 600 scientific articles. Her research is focused on the malleability of human memory, and she's been recognized for her research with 7 honorary doctorates and election to numerous prestigious societies, including the National Academy of Sciences. She's the past president for the Association of Psychological Science, the Western Psychological Association, and the American Psychology Law Society. Dr. Loftus' memory research has led to her being called as an expert witness or consultant in hundreds of cases. Some of the more well-known include the McMartin preschool molestation case, the Hillside Strangler, the Abscom cases, the trial of the officers accused in the Rodney King beating, the Menendez brother trials, the Bosnian war trials in The Hague, the Oklahoma bombing case, and litigation involving Michael Jackson, Martha Stewart, Scooter Libby, Oliver North, Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein, and the Duke University lacrosse players. So Dr. Younggren, Jeff, thank you so much for helping and operating this. And Dr. Loftus, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, we're very excited to have you joining our series and thankful for you sharing your expertise to us today. I'll go ahead and throw it over to both of you.
Well, thank you, Anthony. The only credit that you didn't say is that I'm proud to say Beth has been my friend for 30 years. We worked together something like 30 years. And this format's a little different from the ones that this audience is used to. Beth and I have done these before, and it's more effective to do a question and answer with her because of her prominence and people know of her work. And then at the end, Anthony's going to field questions that the audience might have to ask her as well. So I've written some questions to let her answer. I think that I've written like 23 questions. We'll probably get through 3 because there's so much information that's relevant here. But Beth, And also, I very much appreciate your taking the time to be a part of this series. As you know, this series is important to me, and it's a favor to me that you've done it, and it doesn't go unnoticed or unappreciated. So thank
Well,
you.
thank you, Jeff. I always like talking to you anyhow, whatever excuse we have.
It's true. It's true. Maybe later on we can talk about how we ended up working together on so many cases. But let's start by giving some background to your work. And I'm going to read the questions that I wrote, and the audience just has to suffer me doing it. Can you describe for the audience some of your key findings over the years regarding the malleability of memory and how these findings relate to the criminal justice system and your involvement in that criminal justice system?
Well, that's a huge question. But first of all, let's start with the research part of the question. Many decades ago, I was very interested in studying witnesses to crimes and accidents and other legally relevant events. And when I started designing experiments, I was showing people films of accidents or films of crimes, and then questioning them in different ways. And so a very old study that got a fair amount of attention was one where we showed people an accident, and then some were asked how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. Others are asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. And we found that just changing a word or two in a question could affect the answer that somebody gave. They said the cars were going faster if you use the word smash than hit. And moreover, they later on would remember things like broken glass that didn't exist if we had used the biasing word smashed rather than a more neutral word like hit. So that was one of my earliest clues, that you could supply people with suggestive information either in the course of questioning them or allowing them to hear other information that could contaminate their memory. And back then, I and other memory scientists would sometimes be asked to testify in court cases where there was a memory issue, usually called by the defense if it was a criminal case, because usually it's the prosecution that has the disputed eyewitness testimony, and the defense has some reason to question that testimony. So, you know, that's just a brief answer to your question, and I could go on much longer talking about either the research or the involvement in the court cases, depending on the direction you want to go in.
Well, let me go. I have a direction, so let me go with the next one then. Just you've used your research to testify and consult in hundreds of criminal cases, some of which we did together. I'm wondering, you speak the ethics of being an expert for the defense. You're seen, and you have written books about serving as an expert for the defense. Do you select cases based upon your suspicion that there is a malleability memory issue in them, or is this a proclivity of interest of yours, serving on the defense?
Okay, so well, first of all, just to clarify something, yes, I have worked on many criminal cases, and in the beginning of my career, I did almost all criminal cases, every now and then civil cases. Nowadays, I do, more civil cases than criminal cases. And whether, usually I'm talking about the malleability of memory, so I'm brought into the case by the side that wants to have that information, that scientific information expressed in the trial. But there are civil cases as well as criminal cases. Now, back in the beginning of getting involved in legal cases and introducing scientific evidence into those cases, I didn't worry about, usually I'm called by a defense attorney in a criminal case, When they call you, I'm sure you know this, Jeff, they don't call you up and say, I think my guy's guilty and help me get him off. I mean, they call you up and say, I just don't know whether he did it or not. Or they sometimes say, you know, I'm afraid I might have an innocent client here and I'm scared to death, because that there's a lot at stake there when you're representing somebody you truly believe is innocent. So, you know, back then I used to do many more cases in a year. And nowadays, because I have many other things to do and I'm still teaching full time and doing experiments and doing writing and things like that, you know, I tend to be a little bit more picky about which kinds of cases I take and which ones I find another expert for them or recommend another expert.
Let's walk into the topic of the malleability of memory then. You know, your research shows that memory is malleable. Can you briefly discuss what your perception of how memory is contaminated and how your testimony helps a trier of fact, a jury, or a judge understand how memory works and doesn't work?
Okay, so first of all, in terms of the research, as I alluded to earlier in our conversation here, I and others, because there's a whole field here, did many experiments where we contaminated people's memories for the details of an event they actually did experience. But right around the early 1990s, when we started to see a huge number of cases of claims of massive repression and the recovery of repressed memories, you know, what became more common was first to conduct the research and then sometimes to testify about it, that shows that you can plant entire events into the minds of people for things that didn't happen. And so in our early studies, we planted false memories that when you were 5 or 6 years old, you were lost in a shopping mall. Or other investigators came along and planted these rich false memories that you were attacked by a vicious animal, or you as a child, or you nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard as a child, or that you committed a crime as a teenager and it was serious enough the police actually came to investigate. And we scientists in memory have been busy in the last couple of decades planning these very rich false memories. So when someone testifies in a court case, let's say a prosecution witness, and says that, you know, my father forced me into satanic rituals, made me kill animals and breed babies and kill those babies. And the defense is looking at this saying, oh my God, you know, where'd all this come from? And jurors were sometimes believing in these stories and convicting people based on this claim of massive repression and recovery of these bizarre memories. This scientific work just presented an alternative explanation. Maybe these were a product of suggestion, possibly from suggestive psychotherapy that these individuals had undertaken. And that's what the memory expert testimony is about when it's introduced into court cases. We are not character witnesses for the accused. We are not saying whether you know, the horrific activities happened or didn't happen. Only here's another explanation for how somebody could be saying something with such confidence and detail if it didn't happen.
That walks into the whole repressed memories issue and the models of repression and the work you've done and the work that I've done, where my experiences has been when people are exposed to traumatic events, they tend to remember them better, not necessarily the details, but the gist of the memory. As you increase the trauma, the memory is better. People know that these bad things happen, but the repressed memory model is very different. What's your take on that, and why we still why are we still dealing with this?
Okay, well, first of all, we can all agree. We can all agree that people sometimes don't have experiences. They don't think about them for a long time. They can be reminded of them. Sometimes they can have experiences that are awful, not think about them for a long time and be reminded of them. And you just have to go to a high school reunion. You can experience this for yourself. But what's being claimed in these cases where there are claims of massive repression is something that by definition is too extreme to be explained by ordinary forgetting and remembering. What's being claimed in these cases is that horrific brutalization gets banished into the unconscious, walled off from the rest of mental life. You have absolutely no access to it. And you need to, let's say, go into therapy and dig all these things out, and that out comes these experiences in some pristine form that you can trust completely. That is the claim that's being made. That's the claim that Richard McNally, a clinician, researcher, professor at Harvard, has in his wonderful book on remembering trauma, has called folklore. I mean, in the opinion of many memory scientists and many clinical university research professors, as opposed to some groups of clinicians, many people believe that there really isn't any credible scientific support for these claims.
But they seem to live regardless of what the research says about it. Like McNally's book, I love that book. I encouraged him to revise it. He says no, he's not going to. But I mean, you have Riesberg's work as well, and it just seems to me that even though the research shows that this is fantastical, that it just isn't supported by the research, this lives in the courtroom. It lives in the popular media. It's a good it has great entertainment value. And so, jurors and judges tend to believe it because they've seen it on TV or whatever. And it just seems to not, the science doesn't seem to silence that model.
Well, I think part of it, yes, it's a favorite of Hollywood to display this kind of thing as if it's real. But also, what the jurors see is somebody getting on the stand and telling a story with a whole lot of detail and a whole lot of emotion, and it's very easy to believe it. It's convincing and compelling. But they don't necessarily get to see how the sausage was made. And when experts get into the police reports, the therapy notes, the therapist depositions, depositions of other people who knew the main accuser, then you find out that things were very different in the past. Oh no, I had a really, really happy childhood. No, I was never abused. And they end up with a therapist who says, well, many people repress their memory. Why don't you just close your eyes and imagine who might have done this to you and how old might you have been? They'll use this guided imagination to dig out what they think are buried trauma memories. And in the process, they're helping the patient create a new reality that then gets expressed in a very confident form by the time they get to trial. So that's partly why, people are naturally believing the stories that they're hearing.
Well, they believe fantastical stories too. I mean, you and I, the first case we did together was the Akiki case in San Diego, where this handicapped young man who couldn't drive was accused of molesting a large group of preschool children and intimidating them, as I recall, correct me here, through killing a giraffe in in the preschool in order to intimidate them into not telling that he was involved in sexually abusing them. Of course, nobody in San Diego was missing a giraffe, but I think you remember that. But everybody believed this.
Yeah.
And
well, it's interesting you said a case we did together. That was a case we were on the same side, but we didn't actually do together because
that's true. That's
we
true.
didn't know each other back then, but we both, you were the clinician and I was the memory person. And of course, in these there are a couple of things about that to mention. That's a kitty case. That was like McMartin, and I don't remember the particular giraffe in San Diego, but McMartin in California that sort of launched this array of kitty cases all over the country. It's one thing when you've got a 3 or a 4 or a 5 or a 6-year-old coming up with these fantastic stories, but later in the 90s, we started to see grown people come up with some pretty fantastic ritual abuse kinds of stories that when the FBI came in to investigate, never found any corroborating evidence.
Yeah, that was a lot of the cult work that people were saying that they were birthing babies as a part of a cult and whatever. And I believe, didn't the FBI produce a report saying that they could not find any evidence that this had
Yes, that
happened at
was
all?
Ken Lanning co-authored that report, and occasionally himself would, speak out about this. I'm not sure if he actually testified in court cases about some of his efforts to find corroboration and never finding it, but yeah, those were, so I remember a Kiki, but well, anyhow, so here we are, and occasionally we're still seeing these claims of repressed memory make their way into court cases.
I don't think people understand the risk that psychotherapy, if used inappropriately, can be in cases of memory, and especially, memories of traumatic. I think that many of these individuals have been in therapy, and therapy is a contaminant. We can talk about that. I'd like to talk a little bit about that, but also what other contaminants can occur. I mean, if my take has been, if you want the best memory, it's the earliest memory before somebody gets exposed to a lot of junk to change the memory. But therapy is just one of the ways that it can be damaged.
Yes, I mean, back earlier in my career, I was more focused on what police interrogators were doing and how the police officers who were interviewing people were sometimes developing a hypothesis about what they think happened, who they think did it, and they could communicate their ideas to the person they were interviewing, even inadvertently. And in one case I testified in, it was a California case, and a police officer was interviewing an eyewitness and showing him a 6-pack, 6 photographs, try to get the witness to identify some. The witness says, no, I don't see the person there. And the officer says, wait a minute, I saw your eyes drifting down to number 6. What's going on there? And before long, we got a witness who now is thinking, yeah, maybe number 6 did it. Yeah, number 6 did it. So back then, I was a little more focused on that source of contamination. But then when we start to see these repressed memory claims, and now the role of some psychotherapy was being implicated, and it's not just, a lot of what was happening in some psychotherapy session, the guided imagination being imposed on patients or clients who said they had no memory, sexualized dream interpretation, where therapists were taking the dream material and interpreting it to mean some sexually inappropriate behavior. The use of hypnosis to dig up allegedly buried trauma memories. exposing people to other people's stories of trauma is another way to get people to sometimes develop false memories in their own minds. But people could develop these, kinds of memories on their own. Sometimes people will draw inferences about what might have happened to them or could have happened, and those inferences can then kind of solidify and feel like a memory. We call that autosuggestion. And sometimes that sort of thing was going on. People would turn on the TV and watch talk shows where satanic ritual abuse claimants were telling Sally Jesse Raphael their story of what happened to them, and then out of the woodwork would come other people who said me too, and come forward with their own stories. So you didn't need to be in psychotherapy to end up with false memories that can have negative effects, of course, on the accused, of course, on their extended family and friends, but also on the patient herself.
Yeah. Thinking that sometimes that cross-contamination of memory can be a real problem. I think that in LA, there were some 250 alleged victims of a physician. And what people want to say, I think, is that 250 people could never be wrong. I'm not sure that I agree with that, and I'm not sure you agree with that. What say you about that?
Well, are you talking maybe about the physician at USC or
Yes.
on at UCLA or something like that? Yeah. I mean, of course, there may have been some individuals for whom something happened, but I bet my house that there were many for whom nothing happened. Jeff, I actually got an email from someone who told me that she got interviewed because she was a student at the university. She'd gone to that particular gynecologist. He was a little creepy. And before she knew it, she ended up with $80,000 of a settlement thing that she didn't really feel she deserved, but she wasn't going to turn it down.
There's no question incentive plays into these cases. There's a lot of money that goes on, but I'm of the belief that it is possible that you could have enough contamination that 250 people could be wrong, as opposed to the belief that 250 people could never be wrong. I mean,
No,
it's a matter for debate there.
Yeah, when you have when you have a large number of people, like you don't usually have 250, but you might have 8 people identifying the same wrong man, and that's been documented. Well, how did these 8 people all identify Father Pagano as the robber when he wasn't? Because they were not 8 independent people. They were not 8 independent memories. They were interviewed by the same people. They were questioned in suggestive ways. And they ended up making this erroneous identification that put a priest on trial. I should say. It wasn't a sex case. Yeah.
I've watched your TED Talk in preparation for this, and I thought it was you mentioned the case, the Steve Titus case. Does that you comfortable talking about what happened with that case?
No, I'd be happy to. So when I gave that TED Talk now 10 years ago, I wanted to start with a case. I wanted to start with a case that was meaningful and important to me. And I decided to start with the case of Steve Titus. Titus was this, young man, a restaurant manager in the Seattle area. He was engaged to be married. One day he's out for a romantic dinner with his fiance. He gets pulled over because he's driving a car that resembles a car that was driven by a woman who'd been raped. And to make a long story short, he is put in a lineup and he gets identified and he's prosecuted and he's convicted for this rape. And he was, sobbing, his family, his fiance, he lost his job, he lost the fiance. And because of a journalist who would win a Pulitzer for this work, who believed that Titus was innocent, that journalist is the one who found the real guy, somebody who committed many rapes in the area. Anyhow, what was sad about this case is that Steve Titus then brought a lawsuit against the people who had, he felt, got him wrongly convicted, including one police officer who may have contaminated deliberately evidence. That was an accusation in the civil case. And just days before he was supposed to have his day in court in the civil case, he died of a heart attack, a stress-related heart attack. He was 35 years old. So I was set to testify in that civil case, which never, of course, happened. It settled. His young son ended up with the settlement money. And, you know, just a tragic case about how horrible it is to be wrongly accused of something, even if it lasts for a relatively short time, a matter of months. It can be devastating. And you know, we have other cases where those wrongful convictions put people in prison for 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years before they're freed.
Yeah, I don't know if you mentioned about it, his fiance broke up with him too, right? He lost his relationship with her.
Yeah, he lost the job, he lost his fiance, he, you know, and this was all part of his civil claim.
Yeah. You do a lot of high-profile cases. Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby, others. How does it impact what you have to say dealing with this high-profile cases? I mean, I always kind of marvel at the fact that this stuff doesn't intimidate you. I mean, you're willing to take on the issue and testify where the science is, when in fact there's this wellspring of antagonism towards your position with these high-profile cases.
Well, I'll tell you, you know, again, when I get a call from somebody, I don't know what I'm going to find. I don't know, are they guilty or not? I don't know if they're being charged accurately or if they're being overcharged. I don't know whether just because they did one thing, it doesn't mean they did everything. But I can tell you, in the case of Harvey Weinstein, this was a difficult situation for me because originally I had been contacted by a Los Angeles attorney who was, when Harvey Weinstein was first accused in Los Angeles, right after the bursting open of the Me Too movement. And I had worked with this attorney before. She was a brilliant attorney. You know, just it's so fun to work with attorneys who are smart and prepared and have the time to really put into a case. So I'd had a good experience with this attorney. And when she said, would you consult with me on this case involving a man named Harvey Weinstein, I look forward to a chance to work with her again. And nothing much really materialized in Los Angeles, but a couple years later, the New York cases, a couple of accusations against Harvey Weinstein did materialize in New York, and he was put on trial. And now they wanted me to testify in the New York case. By this time, I read so much stuff about Harvey Weinstein. There was so much publicity in the media. There were so many people, and I thought, you know, I'm not sure I really want to do this. So I actually found them another expert. I found a great expert. She's a collaborator of mine, but she can do more than just the memory piece. She has expertise beyond that. The Weinstein lawyers met her, they watched her testify, they hired her, and I thought, okay, I'm off the hook here. Somebody else can do this. And then Weinstein, I talked to a friend of his, I think it was Alan Dershowitz, a Harvard professor, and basically told him, you know, you want to have Loftus on this memory piece. So he goes back and says, lawyers, and I would like Loftus. And I thought, oh no, now what do I do? What do I do? So I looked inside myself and I said, why is it I'm feeling reluctant? I'm feeling reluctant because I've been seduced by the media. And I've been telling people for years, don't let the media seduce you. They present a sensationalized versions of things, and it's not always, it's just definitely not complete, and it's not always accurate. And then I thought I was worried that it would hurt my ability to help other people in the future. And I thought, if I back out of this, I'm gonna feel like a coward. And so I agreed to go to New York, testify just about the memory science. In fact, it was teaching testimony, or blind testimony, it's sometimes called. No mention of any specific people, no mention of any specific suggestive things that had happened in that case, of which there were plenty, but no mention, just about the science of memory. And even then, even though Weinstein was convicted of some things, but not all things, there was backlash. And I hear about it in cross-examination in just about every other case I get involved in.
I'm sure you do. I mean, that reminds me of the period that is named the Memory Wars. I admire you because you're fearless. I mean, it's the audience probably doesn't know, but I know that there were death threats against you during the Memory Wars because you speak the science, and that lots of people don't want to hear that.
Yeah.
They don't want to hear the science, and so they see it as a personal issue with you. That was a tough time. It kind of still survives with as you described, these cases that are very passionate. So before we go to questions about when forensic scientists are dealing with cases that involve human memory, what advice do you have to them to deal with these cases? Because most of the people here that are listening are doing these kinds of cases or bump into them indirectly. And so what's your advice to?
Well, first of all, as a clinician who is seeing the patient or client, this is a tricky situation because if you express too much kind of doubt or skepticism, they're going to leave the office and go find somebody else who won't be skeptical and won't express any doubts and so on. So it's really walking a fine line. But again, most of the time when I've written, trying to give clinicians sort of advice, I join with a clinical psychologist and co-author that together, because I don't want to be, telling people what to do, although occasionally I'll be telling them what not to do, because it's something that can contaminate memory. When it comes to, and this is a slightly different question, Jeff, but I think it would be interesting for this audience, which is how you and I would work together on the same case. And so when I get a call from an attorney, I've got a case, and the accuser in a criminal or civil case is accusing my guy of 8 years of brutal rapes that she claims she repressed in her unconscious. Would you consult with me on the case? The first thing I say is, what you need first and foremost is you need a clinician. You need somebody who can say, I've been in the trenches with abused or assaulted people, I've treated them, and I'm going to do an IME if it's a civil case, or I'm going to do, record review if that's possible, and here's my opinion. So I complement the work of the clinician. I'm there just to talk about memory. And if these memories aren't real, where could they have come from? And what I love about working with you is that when you're doing the IMEs, you're getting all the information that you need to try to draw some conclusions about what might have caused the symptoms of this accuser, what's their prognosis, all those kind of clinical issues. But that I am also looking for whether there has been suggestion in the life of this accuser that could be responsible for the creation of a false memory. I can sometimes find it in police reports or other documents, but you sometimes find examples for me in your examinations of those accusers. And so you'll find out that they've talked with all kinds of people, or they've read certain books, or they've, had certain interrogations, or they've been to certain support groups that don't exist anywhere in any other part of the record. And that's been helpful for me.
I always audio record my evaluations to give information, just keep track of things. I think that anyone who's going to work in this area has to spend time understanding your work and the work of other individuals on how memory works. Not to have to buy it, say that it's absolutely correct, but to understand the argument so that you approach it from a scientific perspective. It seems like people frequently don't do that you need to learn. We are about memory. I mean, courtrooms are about memory. Usually, I would say 80% of the courtroom is memory. And so if you're going to be a forensic psychologist or psychiatrist, you have to understand what the science says about memory, and what the myths are about memory. So yeah, it's been a pleasure working with you. What I'm going to do now, Beth, is we've got about 15 minutes for people to ask questions. We have about 750 people here. Not bad. I'm not sure you broke the record.
Wow. Wow.
Not sure you broke the record, but Anthony, how about popping in here and fielding the questions, please?
I'm right here. Of course, we have a long line of questions here. We'll get to whatever we can. Of course, I can already tell you it's not possible to get to all of them, but we do have a very intrigued audience. So thank you so much, Dr. Loftus, for all of this. The links for the CEU will be posted in the chat box shortly. At some point, I'll also share a screen for a QR code for attendees who want to enter that for CEU credits. Somebody asked, a lot of discussion of memory in a psycholegal context has focused on victims. And this person says, any thoughts on the common claim of aggressive individuals that say they've become so angry they black out? Is there legitimacy to claims of poor memory for specific times of committing aggressive acts without concurrent mental health use or substance use issues?
Well, a part of that I can answer. First of all, the memory malleability issue, the extent to which either people can be exposed to suggestive information from other people, from biased questioning, from biased media coverage, whatever, and be influenced, is something that applies to all of us. So it's going to apply to the person making the accusation, and it can apply to the person who's being accused. And, particularly in criminal cases, I think people don't spend too much time talking about memory malleability in the accused, because it's kind of, I maybe understood that accused people might try to deny their culpability or minimize their responsibility. And when they do that, they could be deliberately lying, or they could have a false memory. But it does seem that when the expert testimony does come into these cases, it's more with a focus on what the accuser is saying, because many of these accusers don't seem to have any motive to want to distort their memory. They're an eyewitness to a crime. They're not even, they're not the victim. They don't have anything to gain or lose. But they might be influenced by what happens to them. Now, whether there's something like massive, aggression or anger or something that can cause some kind of a blackout or whatever, I can't really speak to that. I know there was once a really great article that I read. I think it was in the American Psychologist, on people who are claiming amnesia when they are accused of a crime, and whether it's just malingering, they're claiming amnesia when they aren't really experiencing it, or whether something real is happening. And I'm not sure where all that shakes out, but I think you're going to want to talk to a different expert to talk about whether, without alcohol and drugs, because then anything could be blotted out, people can, or commonly do something and have absolutely no memory of what they did.
This is certainly where we get to the tricky aspect of, even if we had robust science in that area, the challenge of going from generalized trends to a specific case or a specific individual about what is being reported as genuine or not, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Somebody asked, from your experience, how has the nature of consulting questions changed over the decades, whether in criminal or civil cases? Have you found certain research findings have been better accepted by law enforcement and legal communities as facts rather than being disputed repeatedly?
Okay, so we have many decades, I say we, the psychological scientists who have been interested in memory issues in a forensic kind of setting. And we can look at what's happened over these many decades. Well, first of all, I can tell you one thing that has happened is that police are now changing the way they do things as a result of the scientific work. And so, for example, and many other memory scientists have contributed to this progress. So many police departments now understand that when you do a lineup, or say a photographic lineup, that it's best to have the person conduct the test who doesn't know who the suspect is. That blind testing is one of the most important recommendations. Why is it a good practice? Because if the person conducting the test knows who the suspect is, number one, they can inadvertently contaminate the suspect. They can show interest, or they can say something that influences the response and the memory. If they're blind, they can't do that. If they know who the suspect is, they can give feedback to the person. Good job. That's who we thought it was. Or, I believe you, or some kind of feedback. And that is going to artificially inflate the confidence of the witness and make them a more compelling witness at trial, more impervious to cross-examination. Okay, good. I guess if they're accurate, maybe, but if they're inaccurate, that's a problem. So there are lots of procedural things you could do before it gets to trial. And now those are implemented in some law enforcement agencies, at least across this country and maybe other parts of the world, because many of the contributors to this field are contributing from their universities in Europe and Australia and other parts of certainly North and South America. The other thing that in the past, when attorneys would want memory experts to come into to a case and testify as an expert witness, sometimes judges would let it in, sometimes they wouldn't. And when a judge refused to admit the testimony, which they would often say something like, everyone already knows this stuff, so we don't need an expert to come in and tell the jury about it, the cases would not be overturned. There'd be a guilty verdict because memory is compelling and convincing, but the verdicts would not be overturned. Then in the early 80s, we began to see a series of reversals of convictions because the judge refused to allow the memory testimony. Now we have a string of reversals in major places across the country. The attorney tried to get the memory expert. Judge said, no, I'm not going to allow it. Defendant's convicted. There's an appeal and it's overturned. So that the National Academy of Sciences, in their research arm, which is the National Research Council, now has issued a report showing a favoring of this form of education of jurors, either through expert testimony or through jury instructions that can clear up some of the misconceptions that people in general and jurors in particular have about memory. So that's a big change over the last 40 years.
Wonderful. Thank you for all of that. Somebody asked if you have an opinion as to whether it's just as easy to plant false memories about common positive events compared to uncommon negative events.
You know, in many of these studies, they planted false memories of negative events just because they want to speak to a world where there are people remembering negative things and how that might have happened. But there are a couple of studies where people have planted positive memories. And in fact, one study that that tried to plant a memory that you had either a positive or a negative encounter with a character at Disneyland found it a little easier to plant the positive memory than the negative one. But that, you know, that's only one study. We have planted negative memories that you got sick eating particular foods. People don't want to eat those foods as much. You plant a positive memory about a warm, fuzzy memory about a healthy food like asparagus, and people want to eat more asparagus. I can't say one is easier than the other, but we've done both.
Wonderful, thank you. I will put up a QR link shortly for people, and there will be one in the chat box shortly. Just bear with us there. You know, I want to thank you. A lot of people asked some questions related to some of the cases like Harvey Weinstein that you had testified in, and the ethical considerations you had there. You were very open about that, and I really appreciate that, your forthcomingness there. Somebody's question that relates to that is, broadly, can you speak a little more about any ethical dilemma of holding two truths, that memory can be falsely implanted, and many times women withhold information about sexual assault due to fear about not being believed, repercussions?
Well, those two things are completely true at the same time. Completely true. And yes, we can hold that same truth, but you know, in most of these cases that I've been involved in, they were not saying I just never told, and finally I got the courage to tell. They're saying, like, you know, things like, one example, for a real example, I was raped from the ages of 5 to 16. And I repressed my memory, and I had no awareness of it until I was 18. And for that, you have to say, just show me that this is how memory works, or show me some proof that it can work this way.
Thank you. I will go ahead and share the QR code, but there is a link in the chat box now. In the meantime, are there individual differences that put particular individuals at greater risk for developing false memories, or is this more of a normative feature of the human brain?
Many studies now of individual differences in susceptibility to memory implantation. And it shows that some people are somewhat more susceptible than others. If you're someone who tends to have lapses in memory and attention, you can't remember whether you did something or just thought about doing that thing, you're a little more susceptible. Very cooperative people, and particularly if you're a little low in cognitive ability, you're a little more susceptible. But I will tell you that some of the most intelligent, educated, experienced, well-known people that we share this planet with have developed some pretty amazing false memories. Sometimes it's been embarrassing when it's been revealed, but to some extent, we are all susceptible to this kind of massaging of our autobiographies.
Someone added they'd be interested in your thoughts about the credibility of pre-sexual abuse cases in altar boys who come forward decades later. And I guess this is the follow-up on that. I'm not sure it seems connected to that, but how do you differentiate real from false memories psychometrically?
Well, first of all, you can't. And what experts who are brought into some of these cases that I've seen, let me just say, on the other side of a case I'm involved, they'll get on the stand and say, I believe these memories are real. They may not use those words because they may not be permitted to use those words, but essentially they say something that is getting that idea across. They're either the treater or they are the forensic expert who's brought in, and they bless the memory, just like the psychiatrist Lenore Terr did in the case of Eileen Franklin, who had accused her father of a number of murders and extensive sexual brutalization, much of which many people now have questions about. And so, yeah, I mean, part of what an opposing expert, can do is to point out that without independent corroboration, you can't know whether you're dealing with an authentic memory or one that is a product of some other process. And we need to basically accept that truth, because false memories can be detailed, they can be confident, you can cry when you tell them and feel a lot of emotion, even though they're completely false.
Somewhat related to this conundrum of, again, like all the translation of individual things to a specific case, any overlap between suggestible individuals positioned to or predisposed to false memories and individuals who might be particularly susceptible to making a false confession?
Okay, now false confessions are like an interesting entity on their own. And there are a number, I know I've only done a small amount of work on false confessions, but so I look to the real experts who've spent their careers studying these things. I know there are many routes to a false confession. Sometimes people just want a lot of attention, and that's why 200 people confessed to having kidnapped the Lindbergh baby, or sometimes there's mental health reasons people do that. Sometimes they just confess to a smaller transgression to avoid what they think is going to be a bigger problem, even though they know it's false. And sometimes they develop a false memory. So that's a subset of the false confessions. And that's where, in some sense, my work overlaps with the work on false confessions. People can develop false memories, very rich false memories, that they were victims of bad behavior, but even also that they committed bad behavior.
We are at the top of the hour now. Of course, we have so many questions here, which just reflects the intrigue and just interest in this topic. Dr. Loftus, thank you so much for that. I want to make sure to open it back to your longtime friend here, Dr. Younggren, to thank you as well. So Jeff, have at it.
Yeah, Beth, I appreciate you doing this. I mean, I'll call you later today and chat about this. You did, as always, a great job. It's a stimulating topic. It's really so important to criminal proceedings and civil proceedings. Your research is great stuff, but beyond that, you're great stuff. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. It's good to see you again, as always.
Yeah.
And that wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. Next week, we have Dr. Kevin Baldwin, who'll be discussing the past, present, and future of mental health courts. We hope to see you then for another great discussion of issues in behavioral health and the law. Until next time.